Every night, she hears the neighbor above her, his heavy, shuffling steps, his rattling cough, the sound of him dragging something across the floor. There's just one problem. The concierge swears the apartment above her has been sealed for 20 years. And every night, the sounds get a little bit closer. The 10th of October, 2024. Towers of cardboard leaned against the walls, their blocky forms casting long, distorted shadows in the stark glare of a single bare bulb. The air was a thick tapestry of scents, the dry perfume of dust, the ancient musk of old wood, and the sharp, chemical bite of fresh paint. A new life, boxed and waiting to be unpacked. She took a final, lukewarm sip of tea from a paper cup and let herself fall backwards onto the skeletal frame of her disassembled sofa, the exhaustion of the day a heavy, welcome blanket. The quiet was the first thing she had truly noticed about the place, the reason she had chosen it. It was a deep, profound silence, a stark contrast to the constant hum of her previous life. The city's distant murmur was just a faint whisper, a sound from another world that couldn't penetrate these old, thick walls. This was her sanctuary. The weariness in her muscles was a satisfying ache, the physical proof of a day spent building a new beginning. She closed her eyes, letting the silence wash over her, a clean slate on which to write her future. It was in that perfect, unbroken quiet that the first sound came from above. It was not a sharp or sudden noise, but a slow, heavy, dragging step. A weary shuffle, the sound of old, worn-out slippers scraping against bare floorboards. It moved with a tired, uneven rhythm from one side of the room directly above her head to the other, a small, lonely journey in the night. She opened her eyes, her sense of perfect peace momentarily disturbed. The sound was so distinct, so close, it felt as though the ceiling was nothing more than a thin sheet of paper. Then came the cough. It was a dry, rattling sound that seemed to shake the very dust from the air, a deep, hollow bark that spoke of long, lonely years and too many cigarettes. It was a profoundly human sound, yet sad and isolated. She pictured an old man, stooped and solitary, pacing the confines of his own quiet life in the apartment overhead. The thought was strangely comforting. The sounds were not a mystery, they were just life, happening in parallel to her own. Old buildings like this were full of ghosts, but they were the ghosts of the living, their sounds bleeding through the thin skin of the floors. She settled back into the lumpy cushions of the sofa, the brief moment of tension already dissolving. Of course there were noises. It was an old building with poor soundproofing, a place where the lives of strangers overlapped in subtle, acoustic ways. The shuffling and the coughing were not an intrusion, but a confirmation that she was not entirely alone, a part of the building's ecosystem. She was just the new tenant, learning the rhythms of her unseen neighbors. She closed her eyes again, the tired, shuffling footsteps from above now a strangely soothing, predictable lullaby. The sounds became a fixture of the night, as reliable as the moon's transit across her window. The novelty of a new home and its quirks quickly faded, replaced by a rigid, nocturnal schedule dictated by the unseen tenant above. It always began just after midnight, a slow, deliberate shuffle that traced a path across her bedroom ceiling. Then came the dry, hacking cough, a percussive and lonely sound. She had named him in her mind, this phantom neighbor. He was just part of the building's character, a footnote in the story of her new life. But then a new sound joined the nightly performance. It was a low, scraping drag, a sound of immense weight and reluctant friction. It was the sound of something heavy, something dense and awkward, being pulled across the floorboards. Her imagination supplied the object, a heavy sack of laundry, an old wooden chest of drawers, perhaps even a piece of broken furniture. It was a sound of effort, of a task being performed in the dead of night, and it added a layer of unsettling purpose to the otherwise aimless shuffling. It was after the first full week, as she was finally hanging pictures on the walls, making the space truly her own, that she noticed the first subtle change. The sounds that night were sharper, the edges less muffled by the architecture between them. The shuffle had more texture, the cough a clearer, more resonant quality. She paused, hammer in hand, and tilted her head, listening. It was probably her imagination, she reasoned. As she grew more accustomed to the building's noises, she was simply hearing them with more clarity. The following night, the change was undeniable. The dragging sound was no longer a dull, distant scrape. It was a gritty, rasping noise, so clear that she could almost feel the vibrations through the soles of her feet. The cough seemed to echo within her own room, a phantom presence just beyond the plaster. An icy thread of unease began to weave itself through the fabric of her comfort. The sounds were not just clearer, they were closer. The acoustic distance between her and the source was shrinking in a way that defied the static laws of physics. She began to actively listen, her nights transformed from periods of rest into vigils of intense auditory focus. She would lie in bed, her body rigid, tracking the movements above. The shuffling was no longer a general noise from upstairs, it was a specific path, directly over her bed. The dragging was a slow, laborious journey from the corner of the room to the area she guessed was the doorway. The sounds were acquiring a geography, a specific and terrifying location that felt less like an apartment and more like the other side of a membrane. Her mind, desperate for logic, offered up a string of frantic rationalizations. Perhaps the sound was traveling differently now that she had furniture in the room to absorb it. Maybe it was an echo, a trick of the pipes and ventilation shafts that made a distant noise seem close. She clung to these explanations, repeating them to herself like a mantra against the encroaching fear. But the evidence of her own ears was a powerful counterargument. The sounds were not being amplified, their point of origin was descending. The pattern, once she allowed herself to see it, was terrifyingly consistent. With each passing night, the invisible neighbor seemed to complete a stage of a slow, downward migration. The sounds that had begun as a faint disturbance from the top floor of the building now seemed to emanate from the apartment directly above hers. The idea was absurd, a thought born of sleep deprivation and stress, yet it took root in her mind. She started to dread the fall of darkness, the inevitable onset of the nightly ritual that was no longer a comforting presence, but a creeping, methodical invasion. The character of the apartment began to change with her perception of it. During the day, it was a bright, hopeful space, filled with sunlight and the promise of a new start. But as evening drew in, the shadows in the corners seemed to deepen, and the familiar creaks of the old building took on a more sinister tone. The ceiling, once a simple architectural feature, became a source of immense anxiety, a thin, fragile barrier between her and the encroaching sound. She was no longer living in an apartment, she was living beneath a slow, approaching threat. She tried to fight it, to reclaim the night. She bought earplugs, but they could not block out the low, resonant thud of the dragging weight. She played music through her small speakers, but found herself constantly pausing it, straining to hear if the shuffling had begun yet. The sounds had become the central axis around which her life now revolved. She was a prisoner of an acoustic haunting, trapped by a presence that she could only hear, and that was drawing inexorably closer with each rotation of the earth. The intimacy of the sounds was what truly began to unravel her. The cough was no longer just a noise, it was a wet, ragged, painful sound, so detailed she could almost picture the strain on the unseen person's lungs. The shuffle was no longer a vague scrape, she could hear the soft, worn leather of the slippers, the slight catch and release of a loose sole on the floorboards. She was being made an unwilling accomplice to this person's most private, weary moments, and the proximity was a violation. By the end of the second week, the source of the noise was undeniably located in the apartment directly above her own. It was a physical impossibility, but a sonic fact. The descent had been gradual, methodical, one floor per night, a slow, patient journey down through the bones of the building. She lay in her bed, staring up at the dark, oppressive ceiling, and a single, terrifying question echoed in the silent spaces between the coughs and the scrapes: what would happen on the night that the sounds had nowhere lower to go? It was the night the sounds declared their victory over the space. She was not eased into sleep, but fell into it like a stone, an exhausted surrender to the nightly siege she knew was coming. She was torn from that shallow unconsciousness not by a shuffle, but by a deafening crash from directly overhead, a violent, percussive sound so forceful it seemed to physically press the air from her lungs. It was the sound of a heavy piece of furniture being overturned, a sound of rage or of a terrible accident. Her eyes flew open to the familiar darkness, her heart a frantic, panic drum against her ribs. The performance that followed was stripped of all its previous subtlety. The heavy, dragging steps were no longer a weary shuffle, they were a determined, angry stomp that paced the exact dimensions of her bedroom ceiling. With each impact, a faint tremor ran through her mattress, a physical violation that made the hair on her arms stand on end. The cough was a deep, guttural explosion that rattled the window in its frame. And the dragging sound, the one that had always been a mystery, was now a horrific, grinding screech, as if a great, jagged stone was being pulled across the floorboards, scoring the wood in a declaration of presence. She lay rigid, a prisoner beneath the sonic assault, but something inside her was changing. The terror that had been her constant companion for weeks began to curdle, solidifying into a cold, dense core of anger. This was not just a noise, it was an occupation. An invisible, malevolent force was pacing above her, claiming her space, stealing her peace, and driving her to the very edge of her sanity. A single, defiant thought cut through the chaos, clear and sharp as a shard of ice: enough. This would end. In the morning, she would not be a victim. She would be an investigator. Sleep was impossible for the remainder of the night. She listened with a new, analytical focus, no longer a terrified audience but a detective gathering evidence. She catalogued each sound, noting its duration, its intensity, its precise location. The stomping moved from the corner above her closet to the area directly over her head, then paused. The dragging sound started again, a slow, agonizing journey of a few feet before stopping abruptly. The night was no longer a period of rest, but the final confirmation she needed to act, to drag this horror out from the shadows and into the rational light of day. The first pale, gray light of dawn felt like a starting pistol. She rose from her bed, her movements stiff but purposeful. There was no thought of coffee, no consideration of the day's routine. Her world had shrunk to a single, burning objective: to confront the source of her torment, to put a face and a name to the sounds that had colonized her life. She dressed quickly, her hands steady, her mind clear. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but it was now fuel for her anger, a propellant for the confrontation she was about to initiate. The journey down the 3 flights of stairs was a descent into a different kind of reality. In the sterile morning light, the building felt mundane, just an old, slightly shabby apartment block. The patterned carpet was worn, the wallpaper peeling slightly at the seams. The profound, menacing silence of the night was replaced by the distant sounds of the city waking up, of doors closing and water running through pipes. It made her nocturnal terror feel distant, almost foolish, a dream that was already beginning to fade. But the memory of the vibrating ceiling was too real, too visceral to be dismissed. The concierge sat in a small, glass-walled office off the main lobby, a tiny kingdom of lost mail and spare keys. He was an old man, his face a roadmap of weary resignation, his eyes clouded with the particular brand of apathy that comes from watching the endless, repetitive dramas of other people's lives for decades. He looked up from his newspaper as she approached, his expression a flat, neutral mask of inquiry. He was the building's historian, its gatekeeper. If anyone knew the secrets of the floors above, it would be him. She stood before his window, the thick glass a barrier between her frantic urgency and his placid calm. Words failed her, caught somewhere between her English and the frantic need to be understood. So she resorted to a desperate pantomime. She pointed a trembling finger upwards, directly at the lobby ceiling. Then she mimicked a slow, shuffling walk with her hands, her face a mask of exhaustion. She followed this with a harsh, barking cough into her fist. Finally, she bent over and pretended to drag a great, invisible weight across the floor, her body contorted with the imaginary effort. The concierge watched her performance with an expression that shifted slowly from mild curiosity to tired annoyance. He had seen this before. Every new tenant complained about the noises of the old building, the groans of the pipes, the settling of the foundation. He sighed, a slow, weary exhalation of breath, and slowly pushed his chair back. He seemed to decide that the quickest way to end this conversation was with a demonstration of fact, a piece of irrefutable, bureaucratic proof that would send this hysterical young woman back to her apartment. He shuffled over to a large, metal filing cabinet in the corner of his office. After a moment of rummaging, he produced a heavy, leather-bound ledger, its cover grayed with a thick layer of undisturbed dust. He blew the dust away in a small, choking cloud and carried the book back to his desk, laying it open with the reverence of a priest handling a sacred text. The pages were yellow and brittle with age, covered in a spidery, archaic script and faint, blue-inked architectural diagrams. This was the building's Bible, the record of its every room, its every wall, its every secret. His gnarled, nicotine-stained finger landed on a page and began to trace its way down a column of apartment numbers. He moved with an agonizing slowness, his lips moving silently as he counted. She leaned in, her breath held tight in her chest, her eyes fixed on the book. The smell of old paper and dust filled her nostrils. The entire world seemed to shrink to this single, momentous act, this slow revelation of a simple truth that would either restore her sanity or shatter it completely. His finger finally stopped, pressing down on a line of faded ink. He turned the book around to face her, his finger still pinning the page. He tapped the entry twice, a definitive, final gesture. She stared at the diagram. She saw her floor, the layout of her rooms, her apartment number clearly marked, 4B. Her eyes instinctively moved to the space directly above it on the plan, the space where apartment 5B should have been. But there was no apartment. There was only a single, large, undivided rectangle that spanned the entire top of the building. And inside it, written in that same, spidery script, was a single word, attic. Her mind refused to process what her eyes were seeing. It was impossible. She looked from the book to the concierge's impassive face, searching for some sign that this was a mistake, a misunderstanding. He simply stared back at her, his expression unchanging. Then, he slowly shook his head, a single, deliberate motion. He raised his hand and made the unmistakable gesture of a key turning in a lock, then shook his head again. He pointed to the word attic, then held up all 10 fingers, twice. He was telling her it had been sealed, empty, for decades. The floor seemed to drop out from beneath her. The foundation of her reality, the simple, logical explanation of an old, noisy neighbor, had not just been cracked, it had been utterly vaporized. The sounds were real. The descent was real. But the source was not a man in an apartment. The source was a place that was supposed to be empty, a sealed, forgotten space that had been silent for years. A cold, existential dread, far more profound than any simple fear, washed over her. She gave the concierge a weak, numb nod and turned away. The 3 flights of stairs back to her apartment felt like an impossible climb, each step an act of immense will. The building was no longer a collection of homes, it was a vertical tomb, and she was living just below its most secret, most active crypt. She let herself into her apartment, the click of the lock echoing in the sudden, terrible silence. She stood in the middle of her living room, her arms wrapped around herself, and slowly tilted her head back. She stared up at the ceiling, at the smooth, white, impassive plaster. It was no longer a ceiling. It was a floor. And something was living on the other side of it. Fear was no longer a visitor, it became a permanent resident of the apartment, an unseen entity that shared her space and breathed her air. The revelation from the concierge had stripped away the last vestiges of rational explanation, leaving her stranded on a desolate island of pure, illogical terror. The building was no longer a home. It was a structure built around a monstrous secret, and her apartment was the final, fragile barrier. Now, every sound was a potential signal. The groan of the pipes, the hum of the refrigerator, the sigh of the wind against the windowpane, each was a whisper from the thing that lived above. Sleep became a forgotten luxury. The nights were a long, taut wire of hypervigilance, her body rigid in the darkness, her ears straining for the first telltale shuffle from the ceiling. She began to feel as though she were the one haunting the apartment, a ghost in her own life, tethered to the single, obsessive act of listening. She needed proof. She needed to anchor this auditory nightmare in the real world, to capture it and show it to someone, to prove that she was not losing her mind. The thought of being disbelieved was now almost as terrifying as the sounds themselves. One night, as the familiar, heavy stomping began its nightly patrol above her head, she took out her phone. Her hands trembled as she opened the voice recording application. Standing on a chair, she held the device as close to the ceiling as she could, the microphone pointed directly at the source of the deafening noise. To her, the room was filled with the sound of the dragging, the hacking cough, the angry, stamping feet. It was a cacophony of malice. She recorded for 10 minutes, a long, silent prayer that the small electronic device could hear what she was hearing. She sat on the edge of her bed, the recording finished, and plugged in her headphones, isolating herself from the real-time sounds still emanating from above. She pressed play. The recording was pristine. She could hear the faint, ambient hum of her own room, the whisper of her own breathing, the distant siren of a passing ambulance. But there was nothing else. No shuffling. No coughing. No dragging. The sounds existed only in the space between the ceiling and her own eardrums. They were a private performance, a concert for an audience of one. The silence on the recording was a judgment, a cold, digital voice telling her that this was all in her head. The failure pushed her over the edge. The isolation was absolute. She was trapped in a sensory reality that no one else could access and no machine could verify. In a final, desperate act of self-preservation, she called the local police. The voice on the other end of the line was calm, professional, and imbued with a weary patience that made her feel insane before she had even finished her first sentence. She tried to explain, her voice a thin, reedy thing, describing sounds from a sealed attic, a presence that moved closer each night. The silence on the other end was heavy with skepticism. The officer who arrived was a large, solid man whose physical presence seemed to take up all the air in the small apartment. His expression was a carefully neutral mask, but his eyes held a familiar, tired boredom. He listened to her frantic, whispered story with a practiced stillness, his gaze sweeping over the room, noting the unpacked boxes, the air of transient chaos. He was a creature of the logical world, a world of facts and physical evidence, and she had none to offer him. She was just another frightened, lonely person in a big city, hearing things in the night. He performed a perfunctory inspection. He walked the perimeter of the apartment, his heavy boots a comforting, solid sound on the floorboards. He rapped his knuckles against the ceiling, the sound a dull, hollow thud. He listened, his head cocked, for a full minute. Of course, the sounds had ceased the moment his footsteps had echoed in the stairwell. The apartment was perfectly, unervingly silent. He delivered his verdict with a gentle, practiced condescension. Old buildings made noises. Pipes contracted. Sound traveled in strange ways. There was nothing to worry about. The click of her front door closing behind him was the sound of a cell door locking. The rational world had come, had looked upon her terror, and had found it to be baseless. She was alone again, officially and completely. She sank onto the sofa, a profound, bone-deep exhaustion settling over her. She waited for the sounds to resume, for the stomping to begin its victory lap on her ceiling. She waited for the inevitable. But the night remained silent. Midnight came and went. Then 1 o'clock. The quiet was absolute, a deep, unbroken peace she had not known in weeks. A fragile, tentative hope began to bloom in the sterile soil of her despair. Had the officer's presence been enough? Had the simple intrusion of the outside world frightened the thing away? Or, the most terrifying and hopeful thought of all, had he been right? Had it all been a product of stress and an overactive imagination, a psychological fever that had finally broken? She allowed herself to unclench her muscles, to breathe deeply. The silence was no longer menacing, it was a sweet, profound relief. For the first time, she believed it might be over. She lay down on her bed, not to sleep, but to savor the quiet. She closed her eyes, letting the peaceful emptiness wash over her. An hour passed in this state of blissful stillness. And then, a sound began. It was not from above. It was from the hallway outside her apartment. It was a slow, heavy, dragging shuffle. The exact same sound, with the exact same tired, scraping rhythm. It had left the attic. It had come down. The blood in her veins turned to ice. The thing was no longer contained within the architecture, it was mobile. She lay perfectly still, every muscle locked, listening as the sound moved with an agonizing slowness down the corridor. It was not the sound of a normal person walking. It was the sound she had memorized over countless nights, the sound of immense weariness and a heavy, unseen burden. It drew closer, the scrape of a worn slipper, the heavy tread of a foot, each sound a hammer blow against her fragile peace. The shuffling continued, steady and inexorable, until it reached her section of the hallway. And then, directly in front of her door, it stopped. The silence that followed was 1,000 times more terrifying than the noise had been. It was a silence of presence, of waiting. The thing was there. It was just outside, separated from her by a few inches of wood. It knew which door was hers. It had descended through the building, a floor at a time, and now it had arrived at its destination. Her destination. After an eternity, she forced her body to move, to slide from the bed and creep across the floor on trembling legs. She reached the door, her breath held tight in her chest, and pressed her eye to the cold, brass peephole. She saw nothing. Just the empty hallway, illuminated by a single, flickering fluorescent light. The worn, patterned carpet stretched away into the gloom. The opposite wall, with its peeling, water-stained wallpaper, was exactly as it always was. There was no one there. No stooped old man, no shadowy figure, nothing. The space outside her door was completely, utterly empty. And yet, she knew with a certainty that defied her own eyes that it was standing there, just beyond the range of the lens, waiting. The shuffling had stopped. The waiting had begun. 3 days passed in a state of profound, unnerving silence. The absence of noise was now as loud and menacing as its presence had been. The nightly ritual was broken, the shuffling in the hall had not returned, yet the apartment remained a place of high tension, a stage waiting for the actor who refused to make his entrance. She existed in a state of suspended animation, every nerve ending firing in anticipation of a sound that never came. The quiet did not bring peace, it brought a new kind of anxiety, the dread of the unknown, the fear that the rules of the haunting had changed. She could not eat. She could not sleep. The silence was a constant, screaming question mark that hung in the air of every room. Was it gone? Or was it simply waiting, coiled in the hallway, patient and unseen? She found herself performing small, obsessive rituals. Checking the peephole every 10 minutes. Pressing her ear against the cool wood of the front door, listening for a breath, a rustle, anything. The apartment had become a cage, and the silence was the bars. She knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and liberating, that she could not live this way. She had to know. The journey back down to the concierge's office was one of grim determination. Her fear was still a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but it was now overlaid with a layer of defiant resolve. She would not be driven from her home by a phantom, by a silence. She needed to see the source, to confront the emptiness, to prove to herself that the space above her was just a space. This time, she did not mime her distress. She walked up to the glass, looked the old man in the eye, and pointed to the ceiling. Then, she held out her hand, palm up, a silent, non-negotiable demand for the key. He seemed to understand that this was not a request he could refuse. Perhaps he saw the brittle, ragged edge of hysteria in her eyes. Perhaps he was simply too tired to argue. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the entire building, he rose and shuffled to a wooden board on the wall, a constellation of hooks holding a galaxy of old, forgotten keys. His finger traced a path over the tarnished brass and rusted iron until it landed on a single, large, ornate key, its surface a dark, angry red with corrosion. He took it from the hook and slid it through the small opening at the bottom of the glass partition. The key was heavy in her hand, and cold, like a bone excavated from the earth. It felt ancient, an artifact from another time. Climbing the stairs, she was acutely aware of its weight, a tangible piece of the mystery she was about to unlock. She bypassed her own floor, continuing her ascent up the final flight of stairs, the ones that were narrower and steeper than the rest. The air grew cooler, thinner, and the familiar, musty smell of the building intensified. The steps led to a single, heavy, windowless door at the end of a small landing. The door to the attic. The lock was stiff, resistant. She had to put her shoulder into the key, turning it with a pained, metallic shriek that echoed in the enclosed space. The sound was a violation of a long-held silence. With a final, resonant clunk, the mechanism gave way. She paused for a moment, her hand on the doorknob, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was the threshold. This was the moment she would either find the source of her torment or the proof of her own madness. She took a deep, steadying breath, and pulled the door open. A wave of air, thick and stagnant as tomb air, washed over her. It smelled of decay, of desiccated paper, of the slow, patient rot of forgotten things. The space beyond the door was a cavern of absolute blackness. She fumbled on the wall beside the frame, her fingers searching for a light switch. She found an old, ceramic toggle and flipped it. After a moment's hesitation, a single, bare bulb suspended from a long cord in the center of the vast room flickered to life, casting a weak, anemic yellow glow over the scene. It was exactly what an attic should be. It was a graveyard of abandoned possessions, a museum of dead lives. Hulking shapes of furniture, shrouded in white dust cloths, looked like a congregation of silent, waiting ghosts. Stacks of old newspapers were tied with string, their headlines announcing crises and triumphs that were now lost to history. A child's rocking horse, its paint peeled and one runner broken, stood in a corner, frozen in a state of perpetual, arrested motion. The floor was a carpet of thick, gray dust, undisturbed for what must have been decades. She stepped inside, her feet leaving the first clear footprints in the ancient dust. The silence here was different. It was a deep, historical silence, a silence of neglect and abandonment. It felt peaceful, not menacing. She moved slowly through the cluttered space, her eyes scanning for any sign of recent habitation, any evidence that a person had been living, breathing, and moving in this forgotten room. She saw nothing. No food wrappers, no empty bottles, no makeshift bed. Only the slow, orderly decay of time. Her path led her inevitably to the far corner of the attic, the section of the room that she knew was directly above her own bedroom. This was the epicenter. This was the stage upon which her nightly torment had been performed. And there, in the center of that space, lying directly on the dusty floorboards, was the only object in the entire attic that was not covered in a thick, uniform blanket of dust. It was a small, child-sized mattress, its stripe ticking stained yellow and brown with age. The dust around it was disturbed, scuffed and swept into faint, circular patterns. She stared at it, her mind a whirlwind of confusion. The mattress was old, certainly, but it had been moved. Recently. Someone, or something, had been sleeping here, or at least lying here. But where were they now? The rest of the attic was pristine, untouched. There was no other sign of life. There was just this one, small, sad object, this island of recent activity in a sea of ancient stillness. It was a clue that led nowhere, a sentence without a subject. She circled it, her fear returning, but now it was a different kind of fear, a fear born of a mystery that was deepening, not resolving. She stood there for a long time, in the weak, yellow light of the single bulb, staring at the empty mattress. And then, slowly, a new feeling began to supplant the fear. It was a wave of profound, overwhelming relief. The mattress was empty. The attic was empty. Whatever had been making the noise was gone. And looking at the pathetic, stained object, a wave of pity, of embarrassment, washed over her. It was just an old house. Old houses made noises. She had been alone, stressed, and she had built a ghost story out of creaking floorboards and her own anxiety. She felt a flush of shame. She had harassed the concierge, wasted the time of a police officer, and spent weeks living in a state of self-induced terror, all for nothing. The mattress was probably just a relic from a long-dead family, the scuff marks in the dust from rats or the settling of the building. She was not being haunted. She was just lonely. The thought was so simple, so logical, it was like a key turning in her own mind, unlocking her from the prison of her fear. A single, short laugh, a sound of pure relief, escaped her lips, and it sounded loud and foreign in the silent, dusty room. Locking the attic door behind her felt like closing a chapter on a particularly foolish and frightening story. The heavy, rusted key, which had felt like an artifact of great and terrible significance on the way up, now seemed like just a piece of old, forgotten iron. The journey down the stairs was a descent back into a world of logic and reason. The building was no longer a tomb, it was just a building, old and full of harmless creaks. The peeling wallpaper was not a sign of decay, but simply a sign of a landlord who was slow to redecorate. Her own fear had been the ghost, and she had finally exorcised it. She stepped back into her apartment, and the air itself felt different. It was lighter, cleaner. The oppressive weight that had been pressing down on the space for weeks was gone, lifted by the simple, mundane reality of an empty, dusty attic. She looked up at her ceiling, the source of so much terror, and saw it for what it was, a flat, white plane of plaster and paint. It held no menace, no presence. It was just a ceiling. A profound sense of peace, so complete and so long absent that it felt like a foreign sensation, settled over her, warming her from the inside out. The need to wash away the lingering residue of her ordeal was a physical craving. She went into the bathroom and turned the taps, the sound of the rushing water a joyous, cleansing roar. For weeks, she had dreaded any sound that might mask the noises from above, but now she reveled in it. She stripped off her clothes, the metaphorical armor she had been wearing against an imaginary foe, and stepped into the scalding water. The heat was a shock, a jolt of pure sensation that felt like a return to the living world. She sank beneath the surface, the water closing over her head, and for a moment, all was silent and calm. As she lay in the bath, the steam rising around her, she allowed the full weight of her foolishness to settle in. She had been so convinced, so utterly certain of the supernatural narrative she had constructed. She had allowed the creaks of an old house and the stress of a new life to build a prison of fear around her. She felt a flush of deep embarrassment for her behavior, for the frantic pantomime she had performed for the concierge, for the waste of a police officer's time. She was not the heroine of a ghost story. She was just a woman who had let her imagination run away with her. Clean and wrapped in a thick towel, she moved through her apartment with a newfound sense of ownership. This was her space again, not a hunting ground for a phantom. She made a pot of strong, black tea, the familiar ritual a comforting anchor to reality. The warmth of the mug in her hands was a small, solid pleasure. She stood by the window, looking out at the city lights, a million other lives playing out their own small, rational dramas. The silence of the apartment was no longer a canvas for her fears, it was a peaceful, welcome emptiness, a sign of her solitude, not her isolation. Finally, she felt the deep, bone-weary exhaustion she had been holding at bay for weeks. It was a good exhaustion, the kind that comes after a long, difficult trial has ended. She walked into her bedroom, the space that had been the epicenter of her terror, and it felt like a sanctuary again. She pulled back the covers and slipped into bed, the cool, clean sheets a balm against her skin. She did not bother to turn on a lamp, finding a new comfort in the familiar darkness. She allowed her body to sink into the mattress, every muscle unclenching in a final, complete surrender. She lay on her back, her eyes closed, drifting in that blissful, liminal space between waking and sleeping. The memories of the past weeks were already beginning to feel distant, their sharp edges blurring, taking on the quality of a half-remembered nightmare. The shuffling, the coughing, the dragging, they were the sounds of an old building, nothing more. Her mind, finally free from its obsessive listening, began to quiet down, to drift towards the deep, restorative sleep she so desperately needed. The nightmare was over. The silence was her reward. It was in that moment of perfect, absolute peace, on the very precipice of unconsciousness, that the sound came. It was not a loud sound. It was not a violent sound. It was small, and it was close. It was not the heavy, dragging footstep of an old man from the floor above. It was not the dry, rattling cough that had echoed in her bones. It was a sound that did not belong to the building, to its pipes or its foundation. It was a sound of deliberate, human action, and it was happening on her side of the ceiling. It was a quiet, metallic scratching. A thin, sharp sound, like a wire probing for purchase. Her eyes snapped open in the darkness, her entire body instantly rigid, every muscle locked tight. The peace of moments before was a distant, mocking memory. Her heart, which had finally slowed to a gentle rhythm, was now a frantic, hammering engine of pure adrenaline. She did not breathe. She did not move. She only listened, her entire being focused on that single, impossible sound that was rewriting her entire reality. Then, the scratching was joined by a second sound, a soft, grating noise that was horribly, undeniably familiar. It was the sound of metal sliding against metal. It was the sound of a key, a long, slender piece of old, rusted iron, being pushed slowly, hesitantly, and with an unnatural, fumbling uncertainty, into the keyhole of her own front door. It was not descending from the attic anymore. It had already arrived. And now, it was letting itself in.